Hi, I am Jorge Dyer. I am the General Secretary of the Brazilian American Spiritist Association of Brazil, and on behalf of the International Spiritist Medical Association, I want to greet everyone who is with us at this event. Today, it's an immense pleasure to be here to introduce my friend, my colleague, and a great researcher in the area of mediumship, Dr. Marco Aurelio Vinhosa Bastos Jr. He's a medical doctor, graduated from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where he got his residency in endocrinology and metabolism at the University Hospital of the Ilha do Fundão, with a specialty in homeopathy at the Homeopathic Association of Mato Grosso do Sul. He holds a master and a PhD degree in health and development from the Federal University of Mato Grosso do Sul, and is currently collaborating professor in graduate studies in health development at the university. Today, he's going to talk about scientific studies on mediumship, death, viewed from a new perspective. With you, our colleague, Marco Aurelio Vinhosa Bastos Jr. Welcome. It's a joy to have you at this Congress, and it is a joy to have you at all these international symposiums. Thank you very much, Georgie. Thank you for the organizers of this event. It's a pleasure to be here sharing with you some of the fruits of our studies. Just a quick correction, my residency took place at the State University of Rio de Janeiro. The medical graduation was at UFRJ, but residency was at UERJ. But everything else is as you said. But without delay, I will now share my slides so that we can talk about today's subject that George has already talked about. The scientific studies about mediumship and death under a new perspective. This theme, death, is very difficult to talk about, especially in this difficult year that 2020 has been. This Congress, for instance, is going totally virtual because of that, but we have advantages and disadvantages. And so many people have lost their lives. They have died, have discarnated. And Victor Hugo, the French author, has made several comments about that can help us to see it under a new perspective. That the dead are invisible but not absent. And so many of us have lost our parents and loved ones. And he also says that the reality of the soul, because they are not visible and palpable, does not mean that they are also not real. He also says the flesh is ash and the soul is flame. So our physical part goes with the illnesses, with the challenges of life, but something persists. Our mind, our conscience, our soul, they persist. It's a flame that endures. Life is but an opportunity of meeting, and only after death do connections really happen. The bodies hug, but the souls enlace in this bond, in this deeper bond, outside of the physical body. I think these bonds are never lost, these bonds of love. And mediumship has as one of its functions bringing consolation. Not only those who receive a letter directly from a loved one who may be passed, but the works themselves that we have had a chance to read within spiritualism and spiritism, and that show this other side of life, this other dimension of life in which life goes on. And that can be very comforting. And it helps us deal with these difficult moments. And so, in recent years, we have been researching mediumship, and in the talk that I'm presenting to you today, we're going to touch a little bit about consciousness, from the monistic or dualistic point of views. Also, what is the relationship between mediumship and transpersonal psychology? Some anthropological tools for studying mediumistic experiences, mediumship and dissociation, and studies evaluating the veracity of mediumistic communications, and studies geared towards the process of mediumistic phenomenon. So, mediumship. The medium would be the intermediary capable of bringing information from a different plane, the spiritual world, from other people. We're going to see that to take mediumship as a possibility, we need to believe in duality, in which the mind is a different thing, a different substance from the body, and that this mind persists upon death of the physical body and can in some way communicate. And mediums, and people who have this ability, will be able to perceive the influences of other minds that are no longer in the physical body and convey the information to other beings, or to perhaps perform healing under the influence of these beings who no longer possess a physical body. So, for instance, here we have Chico Xavier psychographic mediums applying hands-on healing. So, consciousness, as I spoke, is this paradigm. And one of the challenges of philosophy and the challenges of science as well, that we're still far from deciphering. The brain would generate a one-sided product. It's only the brain that generates the mind as a result of neuronal processes. Or in some ways, could the mind exist independently and use the brain as an instrument to express itself, to modify behaviors? So that is still the open question. Dualism, also called Cartesian dualism, proposes that the mind is immaterial and the body is material, and that although they are fundamentally distinct, they interact causally. And this view argues at this connection of the mind with the brain that allows thought. Monism, on the other hand, a more materialistic theory, argues that the solution to the mind-brain problem is that mental phenomena are caused by biological processes in the brain. Only in that direction, matter generates mind, and it is not bilateral. Consciousness is seen as an epiphenomenon of the brain, an accessory element with no ability to determine human behavior. Consciousness is caused by the brain, but it does not itself cause changes in the brain. Each conscious state is determined by a simultaneous brain state, and Cyril, professor of philosophy, defends this thesis. And there's also the cognitivistic view from cognitive behavior neuroscience that's prevalent in the scientific community and has some contributions and discoveries on the issue of consciousness and focuses on attention. Because a conscious would be a state of awareness. When we are in coma, for instance, or even under general anesthesia, we are not in that state of awareness, or when we are under general anesthesia. Awareness is linked to the ability to respond to certain external stimuli. And the human subjective experience usually requires attention, because when we wake up, we start paying attention to everything, like a spotlight of sorts. Whether internal or external stimulus, it's a continuous flow of thoughts that drive attention. Attention links our sensations to our actions, so we can achieve a certain purpose. This is related to neuronal phenomena. For example, we're not going to go too much into it, but a stimulus that captures our attention, that activates many more brain areas than a visual stimulus that we're not paying attention to. The stimuli that are only in the area of visual perception of the occipital lobe. But if we're paying attention to that, our temporal lobe, our memories, the prefrontal lobe will activate at the same time. And if we have any strategy in relation to that object. So what attention does is to improve our ability to identify certain stimuli by increasing the firing rate of neurons that are detecting the stimulus and reducing the background noise that's unrelated to the neuronal population. So there are some theories, but we're not going to go deeply into that. But one of the main theories is that consciousness is like a stage, which is the global space theory. There would be exactly there a focus on all the things that are in our subconscious, the memories, all accumulated learning we've had, and we have an internal narrator, and this focus, this global focus, as if you were a workspace, will have some sensory inputs, and there will be output, our behavior and language. So this is a theory that has proposed by Bars in the 1880s, is widely accepted. It doesn't explain everything, but brings many contributions. There are other theories as well, such as Damasio's, which values the somatic part, the visceral sensations as a source of this consciousness, but we won't go into detail. And we'll talk about these views later in a broader manner. We also have human beings and even other animal species who have self-consciousness, which is the ability to reflect on their own thoughts and feelings. We recognize as a separate being having our thought, our internal milieu. And this was an evolution of the theory of the mind, in which our brain, there is a social cognition, and we're very social beings, and there are other species as well, such as the dolphins and some primates. It's an advantage to know what other people are thinking, to be able to anticipate. If we think about our survival, if we have to guarantee our survival, we must anticipate to have their strategy for attack or defense. And this will develop, and there's also the theory of the tertiary mind, in which you know what the other people think of what you're thinking. And according to this theory, this was evolved so much that it's generated self-consciousness. And in terms of neuroimaging, since the 90s, with contributions from Francis Crick, who's a scientist that, along with James Watson, unraveled the DNA molecule. He was very interested in the study of consciousness and put that as a challenge to contribute in that field. And Crick, through the electroencephalogram, saw there was a self-consciousness and self-reflection resulting from the synchronization between certain regions of the parietal and temporal lobes. There was the need for that connect, a synchronicity between places. And there's a close overlap of this pattern of activity in these regions with the neural circuit involved in social cognition, reinforcing the previous thesis that is related to social cognition, as if you were a special type of social cognition, the self-consciousness. And curiously, I'm not going to go much into it, but the spiritual experiences are based on theories that argue that religion has a role in transforming ourselves to create an ideal self based on memories and culture into something that the person wants to become, somehow suppressing an earlier self that needs to be modified and approaching that ideal self. And this apparently activates the areas of social cognition. For example, when a person is doing certain activities like performing a prayer, areas of social cognition are recruited, perhaps communication with God or with spirits. And neuroscience considers that understanding the basis of human consciousness remains a challenge. Despite some contributions, it is still unable to explain and only begins to learn how to approach the issue. For example, the relationship with attention and social cognition. It's not clear why certain patterns of brain activity give rise to subjective experiences. There is a gap. As referred in English, we call it the explanatory gap. There are several theories, but there is no consensus. And in that space, there are also the post-materialist theories. One of the main proponents is the physicist David Bohm. Another is Olivier Brabant, who in 2016 made these propositions of post-materialist theory, also based on 19th century works of Frederick Myers, David Bohm, and David Bohm was an eminent name in quantum physics, showing that these theories even have some evidence that there is a self and a latent reality in the quantum domains, in which there will be a subliminal self and a supraliminal self. One expressed in this classical reality, and the other in this quantum world, and there will be a threshold between them. If the mediums, if we can speculate, would they be able to act at the same time in both worlds and be able to communicate? What the authors propose is that we're all in two dimensions. But some people would have a greater ability to penetrate between these two planes. So we can think of a constant exchange between your spiritual and physical components. Even thinking about our hormones, how our mind influences our behaviors, and how the physical body feeds back our mind. And so can the individual's mind or consciousness or soul survive the death of the physical body? If so, could they somehow communicate with the living? Many researchers in the past, prominent names such as Myers, as I said, William James, who's got a work in which he investigated the study of spiritual and religious experiences, Charles Richet, a French physiologist, winner of the Nobel Prize in Medicine, William Crookes, a physicist. All of them delved into the studies of mediumistic phenomena and witnessed materialization phenomena. And there is also the Society of Psychical Research, established in the 19th century, that stands to this day in England and some branches in the United States as well. And they've led some contributions even for the beginnings of psychology and psychiatry. But these studies suffered a setback, and it was only much later that the interest in these studies of this phenomena have re-emerged. For example, at the end of the 20th century, Pin van Lommel, with the study of near-death experience, showed what very robust data of patients collected over 8 years, that at times when patients had no cardiac electrical activity, they could, after the moment, and after the cardiac moment ended, they could return and accurately describe objective things in the settings which they could not otherwise had access, even without brain activity. And they describe things in manners in which they could not have otherwise access to. It really made people think. And to this day, it's one of the experiences that elicits great interest, that the consciousness can exist outside the physical body, even if the brain is not working. With no blood flow in the brain, the person keeps these memories. But there's not only this author. Today we have different meta-analysis on near-death experiences, and it shows that this phenomena really exists. And as I said, there were setbacks early on in the fields of psychology and psychiatry in terms of mediumship in the 50s and 60s. Transpersonal psychology emerged. And that's a type of psychology that values the human being's spiritual dimension, spirituality, and spiritual experiences. This is one of its exponents, Charles Tart, and another one is Maslow as well. And they study the outer states of consciousness, the transcendent experiences, and investigated the extrasensory perceptions. And spirituality is a personal search to understand profound questions about life, meaning, and the relationship with the sacred. The search that may or may not lead to the development of religious practices. It's not necessarily a religion, but the contact with the sacred. And mediumship is often included among spiritual experiences, in which the person is in an altered state of consciousness when the person receives information. That is a qualitative change in the pattern of mental functioning. People sometimes see themselves as another person, see themselves from the outside, and the spirit uses the person's body to express itself. And that's a qualitative change. Here's a model proposed by Tart, and that in some other research that's been done, that an incarnate person is consulting a medium to obtain information about a third person who has already passed away. And somehow, this telepathic communication takes place, and the medium would communicate with the soul of the deceased. As they don't have a regular communication, it could take place somehow telepathically. There are guidelines for this type of research, and we're going to go through this quickly. That we research, but especially we should avoid prejudice, look for theories, literature, review literature, and avoid stigmatizing what is different. And we're going to see that culture has a role as well, and make sure that we have developed appropriate instruments. Be careful in choosing terms to avoid calling it as a disease. Consider the role of culture, always. The researcher's posture must be neutral but empathetic, open to the unknown, impartial, and rigorous. But if you are skeptical about it, you might even harm the person who is having that experience. So like all science, try to establish causal links, conduct longitudinal studies, consider the complexity of the relationships between anomalous experience and psychopathology, and try to assess reliability, external consistency, and evaluating different ways the same information gathered. Have a diversity and creativity in the choice of methods. And it's important to talk a little about anthropology, because anthropologists analyze the cultural practices of certain groups and compare them with practice of other societies without judging any of them as being superior or inferior to the other. And whenever we analyze a culture, we observe it from our perspective, but it's important not to judge. We can study other religions. The researcher can have her own religion, but she can study other religions to assess the meaning of the practices and for the people themselves, and compare them. Compare them with other societies without judgment, with a neutral and empathic attitude. And we must learn from anthropologists to have that empathic attitude. And transcultural psychology studies the differences and similarities in psychological and social functioning in different cultures and ethnic groups, looking for universal principles that would apply to all cultures. They study different experiences and contexts, but they focus on what they have in common. We often have more in common than differences. And they work to produce knowledge about the phenomenon, defining the extent to which they are universal and to which point they're specific to one culture. And one of the things that has been observed is that spiritual experiences, they're related to dissociation. There will be sensations and behaviors that seem to occur separately from the main flow of consciousness. Dissociation can vary in a continuum from normal to pathological, from normative episodes, depending on the context, such as absorptions or daydreams, to the extreme, such as prolonged and frequent episodes that interfere with mental functioning, identity changes, multiple personalities. There's a long path between these 2 points. It is also considered that pathological dissociation can be a defense mechanism as a way to get away from something traumatic, an event, strong psychological trauma, acute in that initial moment. And only when it becomes persistent, then it becomes pathological. In general, dissociation has 3 components: absorption, depersonalization, and amnesia. The latter are already more pathological, while the first 2 are more normative, particularly absorption. But mediumship has a disease code, the ICD. It has code F444.3, which is a disorder of possession, in which the person loses control of his or her life because they feel possessed by spirits. But there's a caveat. When it occurs in a controlled manner within a religious or cultural context, it's not a disease, in which case psychiatrists and psychologists should avoid stigmatization and unnecessary psychiatric treatments. So if science has already advanced in this direction, demonstrating the importance of culture. So, for instance, we see spiritual possession can be seen in Islam, where they use some criteria to differentiate pathological processes. Here, for instance, another study was done on the religions of African origin in Brazil. In Spiritism, we study a meeting of this obsession with Evaldo Franco, the medium, and he will talk about our finds later. And here, Rebecca Seligman is an author of cultural neuroscience, and she advocates the need for a bioculture approach on dissociative consciousness. And she lives in the United States. So we talk about dissociation. And I also talked about absorption as one of the components of dissociation. And there's even a personality trait created by this author, Telegen, an author who created a questionnaire in the 70s in which he sees a personality trait. The person seems to have a greater sensitivity and a greater clarity of experiences, perceptions, an openness to experience. They're not so instrumental and focused on the objective, but they seem to immerse themselves in the experience. And these people, we've been observed, they have more spiritual experiences. We're going to see certain people with spiritual experiences having this personality trait. They have a general tendency to have more spiritual experiences. In a recent review by Lifshitz, participants with a high score on the Telegen absorption scale, they report vivid experiences of hearing God's voice during prayer and intense mystical experiences in response to psychedelics or placebo brain stimulation, strong feelings of presence and transcendence when faced with natural beauty, virtual reality, or music. So the author suggests that absorption captures an experiential mentality that intensifies the internal and external sensory experience. So when we research the psychological characteristics of mediums, it's important to study other spiritual experiences in which this positive correlation with absorption has been demonstrated. Depth of meditation, of hypnotic trance, near death, and out-of-body experiences, yoga practice, placebo effect. And so we have already talked about research from the past, and these are some important researchers of the present. Edsel Cardenha, who's in Sweden, and some of the most important ones here, Alexander Moreira, Giancarlo Lucchetti, my advisor, Everton Moraldi from São Paulo, all with their important work. Everton participates in the Parapsychology Association. Alexander also with very important contributions, mainly as a research mentor in the whole line of research in mental health. So, what does the available evidence say about the possibility that the minds of deceased loved ones communicating with the living? There are recent meta-analysis on the subject, controlled protocols to test the veracity of the information obtained through mediumship. And here I will show a meta-analysis conducted by Patrizio Tresoldi. He's Italian, I believe, from Padova, I think, who does a lot of research on mediumship and extrasensory perceptions, remote vision, and other things, using very robust and statistical methods He concluded that a meta-analysis result supports the hypothesis that mediums blindly can obtain verifiable information that suggests that they do have this ability to do so, and suggesting the existence of this mediumistic phenomena. And they use protocols that rule out the possibility of fraud. Of course, there's a lot of variations. There are those who don't find a difference. For example, a recent study published this year by Alexander's group found that mediums studies did not statistically display this ability. So, question open still, and the authors argue about the needs to balance environmental validity and control conditions. That is, having a research environment that favors the good performance of mediums, maintaining impartiality and control, and so that they can do what they are used to do to maximize the capacity, and preventing that the framework of the research may somehow disturb it. So blind protocols for assessing veracity demonstrate that yes, mediumistic communications is possible, although many studies fail to demonstrate it. It's important that the researcher's attitude is neutral, also being open to the unknown, and the investigator's fierce disbelief attitude could negatively affect the participants' abilities. And communication between non-local mind and the incarnated medium may occur, as shown by Tart, through a kind of telepathy, some extrasensory perception. Therefore, researchers in the field of mediumship must also be well informed about the evidence produced in experiments evaluating extrasensory perceptions, or sight skills, telepathy, or remote viewing. From several decades of research, meta-analysis have indicated the existence of psi abilities in studies published in traditional magazines in the field of psychology. For example, Cardenha published in 2008 a meta-analysis that showed evidence providing cumulative support for the reality of the psi phenomena, which cannot be readily explained or discarded based on the quality of studies, of fraud, or publication bias, or analytical incompetence, or other frequent criticisms. And so it goes on. Another line of study is the laying of hands with the spiritual component. In this recent work published by Giancarlo's group, it was shown that the imposition of hands with a spiritual presence or spiritist passes led to the improvement of symptoms of knee osteoarthritis, with better functionality and less pain in the group receiving the spiritist passes than in the control group receiving a lay on hands without a spiritual component, which was done by a group with more secular training with the intention of treating the patient, but without the spiritual component. And it's very interesting that the one with the spiritual component performed better, and it indicates the veracity of these events of the spiritual influence. Some types of studies address the themes of mediumship not to prove its existence, but focus on the underlying process. They assume the existence of phenomena and seek to understand its nature. These studies include, for instance, investigations of the physiological correlates and possible biological mechanisms underlying these experiences. And here it's important to say that this is the kind of work that I've done. I'm an endocrinologist, and therefore My work has been related to hormones and behavior over these past 6 years. 6 years? 6 years. And we need to have these tools in order to have a panoramic view, and to deepen our knowledge and to understand the nature of the phenomena, the psychological characteristics of the individuals, using anthropological tools, conducting research in an ethical manner, and respecting the participants, their privacy, their dignity, their safety, and evaluating the autonomous nervous system that regulates these visceral sensations, responses to stress, excitation, the role of hormones with neuroimaging studies and electroencephalogram. Because hormones are there. They are all related to this, linked to the cerebral cortex, the hypothalamus, and that will directly reflect on the production of hormones and on the response of the autonomic nervous systems. If we think that is a phenomenon of the mind that will have expression in the brain, we have to study this expression at the level electroencephalogram and functioning neuroimaging. A few groups have done studies in functional neuroimaging, such as Julio Perez and his team. Also, Alessandra Mainetti had some contributions. There is still a lot to understand, but the results already obtained are very interesting. And as we focus on the glands, the pineal gland is located in the back of the brain, near the pituitary gland. I briefly show some data that we have obtained. Initially they were curious about melatonin, which is the main hormone in the pineal gland. Some studies have shown that in meditation, a type of spiritual experience, that there was an increase in melatonin compared to controls. And the studies we conducted in this line of research, we've seen that mediums often have sensations and experiences considered by some psychiatrists to be hallucinations because they are experiences with no material source. As mediums hear and see things others do not see or hear. And it's important to differentiate between psychotic disorder and non-pathological dissociation. It's necessary to see if we have the same physiological implications. I'm not going to go into details, but just to show that pathological dissociations, individuals usually have a sign of chronic stress, with an increase in basal heart rate, a pattern of reactivity to psychosocial stress, and with an increase in the pituitary volume in the acute phase. And regarding the response to stress, the normal subject, when exposed to stress, is shown in this gray bar, where there's an increase both in heart rate, state of anxiety, and cortisol. And here is a state of increase. But upon regulation of that emotion, then the level of anxiety goes down. And the level of heart rate lowers. Cortisol has an initial rise, but decreases in a few minutes. And then in pathological dissociation, the person is being exposed to a movie with a strong emotional component, and the parameter that reflects the sympathetic activity, such as the level of skin sweat, remains high throughout the stressor phenomenon. In a normal situation, the sympathetic activity rises a little, but lowers shortly thereafter. When there's a pattern of chronic stress, it manifests in the body through the sympathetic system. And psychotic disorders as well. In the acute phase, there may be an increase in cortisol, an increase in the pituitary gland. Schizophrenia, neurodevelopmental disorder, shows a decrease in several brain areas, reduced pineal gland and melatonin secretions, with following sleep disturbances. Here in the study, the volume of the pineal gland is smaller in schizophrenic compared to those in the control group. And in our research, the evidence indicates that mediumship is not a disease. Evaluating many different parameters, such as neuroendocrine glands, stress reactivity, pineal gland chemicals, and compared to non-mediums in the control group, we found similar pineal gland volumes with similar basal levels of pituitary hormones, normal baseline levels of melatonin, pattern of normal emotional regulation, normal cardiac autonomic regulation. We study experienced mediums integrated in the context of Spiritism, most with more than 10 years of practice, and they do not have this chronic stress pattern seen in psychiatric disorders. And we see a couple of things about melatonin. Melatonin levels do not seem to increase differently in response to mediumistic trance. Whether the pineal gland has a role in mediumship, as Descartes said that the pineal gland is the seat of the soul, and also stated by André Louis, we still don't know how this occurs. It doesn't look like it involves melatonin, but it could be through other substances that the pineal gland may produce. Here's a graphic representation of the similarity of the pineal gland size and the pituitary gland as well, between mediums and control. Here's the pituitary, here's in the back of the pineal gland. And here are the basal levels of the pituitary hormones, TSH, cortisol, and prolactin, and were not different between mediums and control groups. Basal plasma levels of melatonin also does not differ, as well as sulfatoxy melatonin during a night's rest. No difference between the groups. This is a urinary metabolite that reflects the production of melatonin. And to assess the pattern of emotional regulations, we designed a protocol in which the mediums perform other activities and control tasks, the help of psychological stress tests, reading tasks, some with stress, others without, and the performance of stressful tasks with the help of a committee in which people thought they were being evaluated, a film, and this triggers the stress in a controlled manner. Also, they had to do some mathematical calculations. And here in another study, it was shown that mediums have a normal cardiac autonomic regulation. And the study mediums during the mediumistic process showed excitation and excitement, an increase of the sympathetic and decrease parasympathetic functions. The controls, however, show parasympathetic activation, which means relaxation. However, at the end, the two groups had similar results, with differences only during the mediumistic act incorporation, showing that they were able to control well the trance with no detrimental effect. Still, in that protocol, comparing the stressor test in red, which raised the stress even higher, but different from what I showed before in the pathological dissociation, in which people watching videos were constantly at high anxiety, where they had a normal pattern and stress would go up a little, but a few minutes later it would return to normal. Here, the activity of reading, which is a relaxation, and the mediumistic activity were halfway, the level of anxiety and heart rate showing good regulation of the emotion. At baseline, heart rate did not differ. The mediums were relaxed during the reading even more than the control group. And there was no difference in melatonin increase in response to trance in both plasma and urine through sulfatoxy melatonin. And there was no difference in these three tasks. And other eventual substances may exist. The hypothalamus is one of the main regulators of the sympathetic stimulator and the parasympathetic, and which is inhibitory system. And the hypothalamus, where the pineal gland is, also has these two arms. For now, we only know the most inhibitory arm, melatonin, but we still don't know how well about the excitatory substances. Here, the melatonin production pathway that occurs in the pineal gland, starting from tryptophan. There are other enzymes that act on these substances that can generate substances with endogenous hallucinogenic effects, such as DMT, bufotenin. They remain at minimum values as they are degraded very quickly, and they have a local effect on the central nervous system, but below peripheral circulation. We try to measure these substances in urine, but this type of research is quite expensive. It was just a pilot protocol, and we found no significant differences in the peripheral level in mediums. But it may be more productive to measure these substances by other methods, perhaps nuclear medicine, receptor binding at brain level of these substances. So the findings on the neuroendocrinology and stress reactivity mediums clearly contrast with the reports of findings in individuals with psychotic and dissociative disorders, which as a rule present abnormalities in practically all the parameters that have been described. This highlights the importance of refining the different diagnoses between non-pathological forms of spiritual possession versus psychotic and dissociative perturbations. And as the evidence increasingly demonstrate that culturally well-integrated mediums are often mentally and physically healthy. The correct differentiation between these conditions could avoid stigmatization and unnecessary treatments. The results found suggest that mediums have normal melatonin production, but an increase in the production of this hormone from the pineal gland that does not seem to be a distinguishing feature of the mediumistic experience. These speculated relationships of the pineal gland with spiritual experiences, if they exist, must be unbased until explored other than through the production of melatonin. In conclusion, research on mediumship in general, even based on these recent studies, should implement measures that increase the credibility of the research results and that decrease the possibility of contention regarding the use of questionable research practices. For example, prior to definition objectives, hypothesis and methodology of the protocols, and specific open platforms for the studies in the field of parapsychology, such as the one I show here. It's also important to do sample size calculations, and in other areas of science, it requires a prospective study program to be developed and applied for funding. And it's also desirable to integrate research into mediumship with a broader field of studies on consciousness. And it's increasingly important to integrate mediumistic studies in this field. Of course, adopt careful, informed, and diverse methodology is very necessary in this field of research, which faces many obstacles, not only because of the subjective nature of the experiences studied, but also due to a priori denial that is found in a large part of the scientific community. So here's the Manifesto for a Post-Materialistic Science, led by Beauregard, with many other authors who proposed this manifesto, which rejects the dogmatism of science. And among other authors, we have Charles Start, Rupert Sheldrake, Alexander Moreira Almeida. It's very interesting, and it's available online. Anyone who wishes can sign it against dogmatism in science in favor of a more open mind for the use of rigorous methods to avoid materialistic dogmatism and allow the emergence of new paradigms. And to conclude, I'd like to express my thanks to Décio Yandle Jr., Vice President of the Spiritist Medical Association. I also thank Dr. Sonia Doi for the invitation, to Giancarlo, to my advisor at UFMS, Paulo Hadamas, to all participants in the experiments, and all the teams that helped me a lot. And even knowing that death comes from God, when we do not provoke it, we cannot yet on earth receive death with joy, because no one receives a goodbye with happiness, but we can receive separation with faith in God, understanding that one day we will reconnect in a greater life, and that hope should warm our hearts. Words from Chico Xavier. And this is a great spirit that helps us so much. We just have to thank you for this brilliant presentation. We see that Marco does not only speak by reading, he's an active researcher in the area. His conclusions are important. And what is most interesting is that we do not stick to rush conclusions. If the conclusions are, at the moment, do not show an important role of the pineal gland in mediumship, we have some evidence that André Lewis already gave us about the pineal gland. We thank you for the brilliant work. And it's not just an article, it's a continuum of research. And Marco should have put his picture in there as well. With Alexander, with Everton Maraldi, who are leading researchers on mediumship in Brazil. We thank you, Marco, and all of you. Our symposium continues. Stay with us. You are receiving high-level information with talks of great quality that brings us greater knowledge on the interaction of spirituality and spiritism and science. It's a great joy to be with you, Marco. Thank you very much. Thank you, George. Thanks, guys. Let's go to the questions.